Okay, good morning to the big crowd here. No, we're just two in the room, so people are very health conscious right now. So we're going to see today the second part of Orientalism, which means pretty much the second generation of artists that are doing some of these works that are fascinated by the Orient. As you see on the title, one is French, the other two one from the Ukraine and the other one Russian. So when we talk about Orientalism, we're looking at often, and I'm not saying every time, but at a kind of a patronizing Western attitude towards the Eastern societies that is, in a sense, there to justify the Western imperialism. As we'll see in a minute, it's really the highest time in the colonialism. We have in the literature one person who wrote a very important book on Orientalism and really defined it. It has since been attacked, but it remains a very important work, and that's Edward Said. In his analysis, he tells that, in fact, these societies are shown as static and undeveloped. And so it really gave that a view of the Orient culture as something that could be studied, depicted, and reproduced at leisure and distorted. And that's really what his problem was. Okay, why isn't that moving? Okay. So last time, unfortunately, that slide got lost in the track, but this shows the colonies that existed during that time. So Denmark, has the Danish India, mostly the coastlines. We have Great Britain from the middle of the 19th century until 1947 in India, and then Egypt from 1882 to 1922. France has Algeria from 1830 to 1962, and French Indochina 1887 to 1954. The Netherlands, Indonesia, Portugal, Portuguese India, and Macau, and Spain, the Philippines. I'm talking just the colonies towards the Asian part, Middle East, Northern Africa, Middle East, and Asia.
So the British colonies sort of supplanted the Danish ones, because it looks like they followed it, or were they in different places?
Typically Denmark and Portugal had coastline little cities,
and Britain was more.
And Britain had the mainland. Yeah. So I'm not counting, of course, all the South America and the rest of Africa colonies. But this gives you an idea that most of the Middle East, Northern Africa, Middle East, and Far East were taken. So that won't work. For whatever reason, it doesn't want to work. So here again is an idea also showing the trade networks that existed around the 9th century, the end of the 9th century, that shows that from very early on, there were an incredible network of trading routes between the East and the West, far more than we ever taught typically. But that is a good way for us to understand how both sides were influencing the other. They found a lot of coins. For example, even in England, in some of the tombs, they found some coins coming from China. So quite interesting. So the painters that I'm going to show today are, oh, don't tell me I didn't put him on. No, I didn't. So I forgot Gerome. And Gerome is running from the beginning of the 1800s to the end of he goes all the way to the middle of the 19th century. Actually, no, it goes to 1904. But these are the previous generation that we looked at. And then we have the two Ukrainian and Russian, Aivazovsky and Vereshchagin, who also both had a rather long career and are not going to fall into the trap of Orientalism the way Said is looking at it, but are very interested in the culture. Oh, what am I? There we are. So Gerome was born in Vesoul, which is in the northern France, in 1824. He went to Paris in 1840 to study with Paul de la Roche, who was a known teacher at that time. Went to Italy with him in 1843, and then joined the atelier of Charles Glaire, who was one of these satellite art schools around the academy. He visited Egypt in 56, married Marie Goupil, and the reason why I give her name is because the Goupil family was very strong into art dealing, particularly prints. It is in the Goupil family that the brother, that actually even Van Gogh, Vincent Van Gogh, is going to work for a while, but where his brother Theo is going to work for a long time. With her, he had 4 daughters and a son. In 1864, he's appointed professor at the Beaux-Arts. And then late in his career, in the 1870s, took up sculpture. In 1904, he was found dead in his atelier, literally in the middle of working. He was a very known, what we call academic painter, and we will talk more about him when we talk about academic painter. He was for sure one of the most successful painter as far as the technique is concerned. And the title page was a proof of it, the one that you saw. This is a really interesting photograph that I showed, because it almost makes you feel sick when you see that you have that group of young men, all with big smile on their face, dressed in dark, and then you have that nude body in the very middle, their model, who I'm sure wasn't too happy to be photographed in the middle of all these well-dressed men. But that is very typical. Don't forget, women were not allowed to take that kind of a training at that time, but men obviously could. As I mentioned, Jean-Léon Gerome went to Egypt, but later on he imagined, I mean, this is painted in 1986. The Napoleon campaign is in is in 19, no, what am I saying? 18. I'm going to say, no, it's actually 1796. I'm coming to it. So it's almost 10 years, 100 years old by the time Gerome paints it. And this is a very symbolic picture showing Napoleon standing in front of the Sphinx. And you almost have the feeling that the Sphinx is asking him, you know, the famous question that, who is that person who walks on 4 feet in the morning, 2 feet in the afternoon, and 3 in the evening? And of course, that was question asked to Oedipus, and the answer was men. That's when they're babies, they crawl on 4, and then you have on 2 legs for an adult, and then an old man needs a cane, and so it's with 3 legs. But it's almost like Napoleon is questioning the Sphinx.
That date is not correct, right?
18, no, you're right. It's 1886. Thank you for the remark. 1886, correction. He is very interested, and I can understand. An artist is always looking for themes, something interesting to bring up. And going to Egypt, he is interested by not only the look of people, but the beautiful colors of their costume, that exotic side. There was at that time some people, this is part of the Turkish Empire, the Bashibazuk. The Bashibazuk was literally means damaged head, crazy head, that were irregular soldiers in the Ottoman army. They were notorious for being brutal and undisciplined, but that's why the colloquial meaning of Bashibazuk means, in fact, undisciplined bandit in many languages. So in French, for example, it became the kind of sentence that was mentioned by a character in a cartoon. And when he was angry at somebody, he would always qualify him of Bashibazuk. And that meant that he was a barbarian, a brutal person, used as an expletive. Coming back to art, in the Black Bashibazuk painted in 1869, which is, I think it's a masterpiece. It's absolutely beautiful the way it's rendered. But Gerome there shows his talent. He was technically one of the most really learned person among the academic painters. He's very sensitive to the color, to the tone of the skin. Really beautiful. On the right, you have another Bashibazuk here, a chieftain, who is there with his skirt. They had some kind of diverse uniform that was not one uniform for all the Bashibazuk. And the chieftain is there dressed on that bench in the corner with the nargile at his side. There's another chieftain, as you can see, the clothing is very different, and he's in the niche. And of course, he's surrounded by these beautiful tiles that were so popular in Turkey. And actually, Gerome had seen pictures. Already then, you have pictures of these tiles that were colored by the photographer. So they had an idea. Don't forget, that time you had no color photograph yet. But just the beautiful surrounding and that very relaxed attitude of the Bashibazuk chieftain. Another one, the little joke. The poor dog is the center of that joke, where the man who is enjoying the nargile is breathing out and having the dog. You know how it is, even with your dog like this, you blow on them and they all get all excited. Again, we can see the wealth of the colors in the tiles at the back, Iznik tile probably. Also some women. This is called the femme Circassienne voilée, so the veiled Circassian woman. This population that was inhabiting the North Caucasus, but because of the genocide that were perpetrated by the Russian Empire in the 19th century during the Russo-Circassian War, they were exiled from their homeland to modern-day Turkey. Just extraordinary painting, because you have that veil that is obscuring her face, but you can guess so well her beauty in the back. And then the very pretty clothing. All these were, by the way, fabrics coming from India. And then the famous snake charmer. As I was mentioning earlier, the snake charmer is a painting that is exhibited at the Sterling and Francine Clark Art Institute in Williamstown. That painting, which is absolutely a jewel, is so tempting for people to touch, because everything seems so textured. You want to even touch the behind of the little boy, kind of give him a little slap, that they had to put a glass to protect the painting, because the people were so interested by it. The tile work is inspired from the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul. And it's really interesting that the painting was sold by Adolphe Goupy, so the father-in-law of Gerome, for 75,000 francs to the New York collector Albert Spencer. And in 1888, Spencer will sell the work for $19,500 to Alfred Corning Clark, who was an heir to the Singer sewing machine fortune. So the painting was loaned out by Clark in 1893, so it could be shown at the World's Columbian Exhibition in Chicago. And then Alfred Corning Clark's widow, Elizabeth Scriven Clark, sells the work to the Schaus Art Gallery in New York for $10,000. That might also mean that they might have exchanged some other artwork at the same time. And then finally, in 1942, the painting was sold through an auction house in New York to a French art dealer, Paul Durand-Ruel, who was very famous, for a mere $500. So you see how the prices declines really badly. At that time, Gerome had fallen very far out of favor. Durand-Ruel was bidding for Sterling Clark, and so that became part of the collection, the famous collection, so for a really stolen price. I would have bought it right away at that price. So this has become very much the center of attention for many scholars as far as Orientalism. So for example, Said says that the painting that was for him pretty troubling, because you had that young nude man facing these old guys there, and really for him was part of that, again, vision of the West, looking at the decadent East. But on the other hand, we have also the beauty of the work that is a kind, puts it in balance. Are you looking at the maybe nasty ideas that go in the mind of these people, or is it just you look at the beauty of the tiles, of all the colors, the details, and the softness of that young body in the very middle? In 1983, the scholar Linda Nochlin published the essay of the Imaginary Orient, and thought that that painting was very much sexually charged, kind of a mystery in the middle of the painting, and shows Eastern idleness and neglect. So this is where you find there are different opinions, and we can respect both of them. But sometimes it really makes sense, sometimes it doesn't. This one, anyway, for me, is an absolutely work of art, just a chef-d'oeuvre. Interesting vision here of an almeh. At that time, the almehs were the equivalent of a prostitute. As you can see under her very transparent costume, you can see the breasts clearly delineated. But she's looking at us almost like Manet's figures later on, who are in the nude and facing the beholder. In this case, we have again that kind of almost arrogant attitude of that woman. This corresponds, don't forget, at the suffrage movement that had started in 1848. And so this is part of that moment where women can be shown that way, regardless the way you think of her. But again, I think technically an extraordinary painting. His representation of the whirling dervishes is always interesting. The dervishes were people that were treading a Sufi Muslim ascetic path, and they were known for the extreme poverty and austerity. Just the swirling is associated with the idea of coming to a certain religious ecstasy that they reach by turning, and they can stop like this, they will not lose their balance. It's rather incredible to look at. But again, the array of colors, the deep blue and the purple that he shows, is just wonderful. Now, beside these interesting exotic images, Gerome is also going to kind of look into a more, how can I say, reprehensible, maybe we can say, a field where he's using the East to show naked bodies that are no goddesses and so on. And really there, I think, showing that negative Orientalism. So before we go into that one, I wanted to straighten up the whole idea of the Turkish bath and the harem. The Turkish bath or hammam is a type of steam bath, and it's a place of public bathing. Yeah, sorry, but I had told my mom I was working. And this is actually inherited from the Roman thermae. In many of the large ones, you have a man and a woman section, and each of them are separated in 4 different rooms: the cloakroom, the warm room, the hot room, and cooling room. A lot of the reading, sorry, but I have to tell her. Maman, je donne cours. Maman. Je donne cours, maman. She was going to write it. So these hammam were described in some of the letters of Mrs. Montagu, who was the wife of the British ambassador to Constantinople. And being a woman, she had access to the hammam, was able to get in, though she would not undress. All the other women were undressed, but had loincloths and had these just wraps that they would typically put around themselves. But the women were very curious about the clothing, because European women were dressed very differently. So they convinced her to undress, and they did it themselves until she was in her stays. And there they got so surprised by what they saw. They thought it was a machine that she was locked in and that she had to sleep in, that she was not able to take away. And so they never went further than the stays with Mrs. Montagu. But that shows you that people have wrong opinion or ideas for Turkish women about the Western women, and for Western women about the Turkish women. So coming from Mrs. Montagu and distorted on what she wrote, there were many other people that wrote about the harem and the hammam in totally distorted ways and very erotic ways. And that was picked up by many people that then are going to show wrong descriptions of what it really was. The harem, from the Arabic harim, was a very inviolable place. This was the place where the female members of the family were gathered. And that included women. In case of rich and important people, could be a few concubines. They were the sisters, the children, the boys until puberty was kept there. So it's not at all what we see, a series of naked women that go there watched by the Sultan, who's going to make his choice for the coming night. But it was in fact a very lively place, just with kids running everywhere. and where women would be, in quotes, protected. So here are some of the paintings by Gerome of the hammam. And you can see immediately by the atmosphere, the attitude of the young woman in the nude in the center, that there is a feeling of shame. She doesn't want to be seen. She's coiled back, kind of protecting her nudity, which was not at all the case in regular hammam, where people would just go and bathe in that, in the basins. And actually the Black woman who is supposed to be there to help her refresh herself is partly in the nude too. She just has a wrap around the waistline. Again, the rendering is superb, but now the spirit of the painting has changed. Here again, he shows the three ladies, one completely in the nude, and the others as they would have been keeping a loincloth or having a wrap around the waist. Beautifully painted, extraordinary colors, a great sense of the bodies and the softness of the flesh and the reflection in the basin. And here the slave coming with a hookah for those that want to enjoy it. But again, showing a scene that would not be exact that way. And this is the harem pool. So again, it's giving that idea that this was a place where the Sultan had his choice of women and would enjoy it. So this is the difference with what we have seen between just looking at the East and trying to understand it, as we've seen with Delacroix, for example, who enjoyed the light, enjoyed the colors, the exoticism of things, but not looking down at people. Here you have that feeling that he is really using the East to just be able to show women in the nude that were not Venus or another Greek goddess, but just the example of a decadent culture. And of course, men were delighted to buy that kind of a painting. They would put that in their library, typically away from the gaze of their wives. Now, a completely different look is going to be the one of Ivan Konstantinovich Aivazovsky. We've already seen some paintings by him. He's an extraordinary landscapist, had a very long career. He died at the age of 83. He's the Ukrainian one. He was born in Feodosia in Crimea in 1817, and then moved to St. Petersburg to study. That was the biggest academy at that time in Russia, at the Imperial Academy of Arts. And then was sent, he was so talented, he very quickly, he stand by the academy to study. And this starts an incredible amount of traveling that he will do during his entire life. So when he goes to Europe, he goes through Berlin, Vienna, Venice, Florence, Naples, and Rome for 2 years. Amalfi, Sorrente, Switzerland, Germany, the Netherlands, Britain, Paris, Marseille, Naples, Britain, Portugal, Spain, and Malta. So just an incredible amount of traveling where he absolutely absorbs all the beautiful landscapes that are under his eyes. While he's in Italy, he is going to change his name from Ivazian, which is very much of an Armenian sounding name, to Aivazovsky. In 44, he returns to Russia, made an academician at the same academy, the Imperial Academy, and then goes on traveling in 1845 to the Aegean Sea, visited the Ottoman capital. We'll see that, did 5 trips to Istanbul, and then the Greek islands of Patmos and Rhodos. Then we'll go back in 45, settle in his hometown of Feodosia, where he marries a year later Julia Graves, an English governess, with whom he has 4 daughters, and he will divorce in 1860. In 1856 and 7, he works in Paris and becomes the first Russian and the first non-French artist to receive the Legion of Honor. In 1882, he will marry Anna Bernazian, a young Armenian widow, 40 years his junior, a very, very pretty woman. He's made a beautiful portrait of her, and dies in 1900 in Feodosia, having produced over 6,000 works in his lifetime. Now, believe me or not, that artist, as you will see, it's absolutely extraordinary. There is not one book to find on him. I'm desperately trying to find on him and Vereshchagin, that we'll see later on. Neither one of them has a book. There's apparently somewhere in Russia, there was a book written a long time ago, but there's nobody that published any book on Aivazovsky. As I mentioned, he is going to be called to Constantinople to paint. Now, remember, Constantinople itself is Muslim. So it's not very appealing for painters because there is very little subject that they can paint. And I have a friend who is Turkish, and she told me when I was mentioning the beautiful landscapes by Ivazovsky of Istanbul, that was still at that time called Constantinople officially. She said, but Ivazovsky, that's the only name we knew of a painter when we were living in Istanbul, because he was the only one that painted landscapes and people in Istanbul. So this is a view from across the Golden Horn, looking down at the Golden Horn. And for those of you that have been there, you can recognize this is Topkapi, and then you have Hagia Sophia, and then the Blue Mosque, and then all the others. And here is actually the photograph showing the same, more or less the same view, except that now there is a bridge that didn't exist at that time. So during his long sojourn in Istanbul, he was commissioned for a number of paintings as a court painter by the Ottoman sultans Abdülmecid, Abdulaziz, and Abdulhamid, 30 of which are currently on display in the Imperial Palace, the Dolmabahce Museum, and other museums in Turkey. So they really appreciate what they see. And the view there, and definitely the sunsets, are absolutely extraordinary. Here's another view of the dusk on Golden Horn. Of course, at that time, you had these beautiful sailing ships that were giving that beautiful image, beautiful profile. And that's closer to the fish market. Here's a view of the coffee house by the Ortaköy Mosque that you see in the background. But again, giving you an idea of the life there. And again, don't forget, as a Muslim, normally you're not supposed to show and to see any of representation of the human being. And here's the mosque. Another interesting view, especially showing women, which is even more special, a boat ride by Kompaki in Constantinople. Again, we can see here on the other side, Topkapi and then Hagia Sophia and the Blue Mosque. the Bosphorus being that strait that goes from the Dardanelles to the Black Sea. Beautiful scene with that fog masking some of the beautiful ships there. The Tofane, I don't speak Turkish, so difficult. Nusreichi Mosque was built by Armenian architects for the Sultan Mahmud between 1823 and 26. And you can see the photograph of the mosque at the back. And another view of the Golden Horn. That's the same as the one I showed before. Sorry, I showed it twice. Here's a new one, the view by the evening light. So what you see there on the left is the Galata Tower. That tower, when you go up on it, you have a fantastic view on the Golden Horn on the other side. But it shows people having picnic under the tree. And again, the Galata Tower there on the left. So these are part of the commission that he received. As I mentioned, he also went to Egypt. This is the Great Pyramid of Giza. Really interesting because you see the Nile River in the background. It's rarely shown at that angle. Seen from Cairo life. So there is an interest, as I had shown, that if you look at his entire oeuvre, he has views of Naples and even a painting on the Niagara Falls, because he came to the US and painted the Niagara Falls. He's just a very productive painter, but really great sense of color and light. So on this one, I'm going to give you 5 minutes to get a cup of coffee or straighten your legs before we move to Vasily Vereshchagin, who is another of a great traveler. So if you have any questions in the room or questions, let me open the Zoom. So if you have questions there, you have 5 minutes to get, so come back at 1:45. Thank you, Pat. But take advantage of this to ask me questions if you have any. Don't you find incredible that there's not a book on that painter?
No, what happened to the museum that was up near the Princess? It was it was Russian art.
You mean in Istanbul?
No, right up here in
I don't know. I don't know.
It was you went inside and the whole building looked like Arizona. It's a beautiful collection.
No, I don't know. I haven't been there.
You would think some art student wanting to get their master's or PhD
yes,
would have done some papers at least, right?
The papers, they probably are. I have found some articles on him, for example, on The Guardian and so on. But the thing is, 6,000 paintings, it's a huge body of work. And so to put something together on such a body of work. There's probably something on the way right now, I
Have
would
there been any
believe.
shows with his stuff collected in like in major museums in New York or?
Yeah, but
There must be something.
it's incredible. As I say, they could just do even just the Orientalism or just do, some of his trips, but it's quite interesting. He's revered in the Ukraine. He has statues, he has his own museum. Oh yeah, no. There, his house is the
On the news constantly, Ukraine.
yes, but being from the Ukraine, his house has been turned into a museum, and he had a beautiful home. So at least there but again, as I say, it's so difficult to get information on beside all his trips. It's quite remarkable. So no question on the net, no question here. And we'll see the next guy is the same thing. And his body of work is tremendous and was quite admired and appreciated at the time. He exhibited everywhere, not one book to be found.
And I have a question on Gerome.
Yes.
Gerome is the painter of the Plessis Verso, I think, in the Phoenix
Yes,
Art Museum.
the Pollice Verso, yes.
And he was, my understanding, really renowned for his anti-impressionism. He detested that movement.
Absolutely, you're right. Yeah, we'll come back on him. This was just the Orientalist side to him. I think it's in a month. I have a whole class on academic painters, and there we'll talk more we'll show the Pollice Verso, and we'll talk about his other works.
What I found interesting, at least for Plessis Verso, was because Pompeii had already been discovered at that time, and how he studied and was so exact. And
oh yes,
right.
You're absolutely right. He was really studying the history and the object that had been found, so that everything was perfectly exact. And the illustration of the Colosseum is right to the detail, where he shows how there was a roof that could be drawn on the Colosseum when it was too sunny. And he shows exactly that there were panels that were pulled. They couldn't do a whole roof, but indeed. But we'll talk about that in a month. He's a fantastic painter. And his quote, I mean, his works are now valued much higher. But he has these paintings where he falls into the trap of this, Western phantasm on the East, if I can call it that way.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting that he didn't do that with the harems, and he did not do the research or the accurate portrayal there. I just find this interesting.
It comes from I think it comes from another side, and it could be that he had a segment of his clientele, that his customers that wanted that. You have these lazy men everywhere. I have a man in the audience here. He kind of, okay, Pat, if you can turn off the light. We're gonna go back. I'm going to mute you again. And we'll open the discussion for after the talk. So we're moving on now to another Easterner. Sorry, here. Oh yeah. Doesn't want to do it. Vasily Vereshchagin, as you can see by the very dense biography, was born in 1842, died in 1904. He was born in the Novgorod region in Russia in 1842. Was sent to Tsarskoye Selo to enter the Alexander Cadet Corps in 1850. He was 8 years old. And then 8 years later, entered the Sea Cadet Corps at St. Petersburg and started his trips to Denmark, France, and Egypt. He then came back in 1961 to study drawing at St. Petersburg Academy, left the cadets. And already in 1864 was sent to Paris, where he studied with Gerome. In 18 68 and 9, he went to Paris, came back to St. Petersburg, and then went to Turkestan. In 1874, he started an extensive tours of the Himalayas, India, and Tibet. And imagine that at that time, that must not have been an easy trip. 1877 and 78, he was present during the Russo-Turkish War. He had many friends among the generals that would invite him to be with him and to illustrate what was happening. Unfortunately for them, he did it in the opposite way that they were expecting. 1880, he exhibits in Munich, Paris, London, Berlin, Vienna, Dresden, where he experienced the ban of many of his paintings, particularly in Germany. The German generals didn't like the way he was portraying the army, and so often prevented their soldiers to even visit the exhibition. 1884, he went to Syria and Palestine, was again a witness of the first Sino-Japanese war in 1894 and 95, was in 1900 in Manchuria during the Boxer Rebellion. And he died on April 13, 1904, when he was on the Petropavlovsk ship that was struck by 2 mines while returning to Port Arthur. And that sank, taking with it most of the crew, including both the Admiral Makarov, who was the friend of Vereshchagin, and Vereshchagin himself. Quite an interesting life. And we'll see is that intense interest. I can only show you a sampling because, again, that's a guy that was extremely productive, probably had close to as many paintings as Aivazovsky, but was very fond of showing the real life in the East. So here are some of the paintings that he did while, that's early on, just the Turkestan, where he contributes to that very attractive image of the colonial Central Asia. And he was at that time one of the main witnesses of what was happening there. So it's again with the general governor that financed his visit twice in 1868 and 70 that he was able to see all these people, the monuments, and also the landscape of the Russian Turkestan. He did about 250 drawings and paintings by the painter. By him, sorry. The way he approached the Orient is with realism and a very critical spirit of what was a group of Russian painters at that time called the travelers, that were going around Russia and trying to bring back images of the reality of it back to Moscow or St. Petersburg. But they also, his works are going to be very critical, the way the Russian army is going to deal with the local. And for that reason, he's become really the defensor of peace, according to the people. Many of his paintings were banned, as I mentioned before. So this is just a lovely description of the dervishes in their festive outfits. An interesting scene, because there you almost feel like he's seen the painting by Gerome. But it's that young boy that is being sold as a slave. Though I like the very gentle way that the guy that is sitting is looking at him. This is another view, and as I mentioned, just where Vereshchagin is depicting the brutal business of war. A lot of his painting, and I'm passing a lot because I lack of time. But what you see, first of all, is just that beautiful mosque in Samarkand, where they are, and you see that whole group of people sitting around that place. And then your gaze is suddenly looking at these poles, on top of which are different heads that people that are decapitated and were exhibited there as trophies of war. So typically the military that were visiting his exhibition when these kind of works were exhibited demanded the paintings to be taken down, not to badly impress the soldiers that could visit the exhibition. Also interesting that Vereshchagin, who did the portrait of many people, never made any portrait of Gerome. This is another of these beautiful, again, it's Samarkand, it's the mosque, and you see the presentation of the trophies, and what you see here down here, it's a whole series of heads that have been put down at the feet of the victor. But his attention to the detail of the architecture is absolutely extraordinary. He went to India, and there he shows the Taj Mahal. You can feel that sensitivity he has to the color and the light, the reflection of light. He made many portraits, and I just picked these three because I think they're quite representative of what he did. The women feature very infrequently in Vereshchagin's work, and this is interesting to see that Uzbek woman in Tashkent, that is dressed as we know now with in Afghanistan, covered in the black robe, even her eyes are hidden. But on the other hand, the sensitivity that he has to the color of that bill on the left there, and then the other one, the Parsi priest, show his incredible talent. Went on to India. This is the mounted warrior in Jaipur. Again, that sense, that pleasure he has to show that texture, the different texture, the oriental that covers the horse, and then the shimmering body of armor worn by the guard there on the left is just magnificent. In '84, as I mentioned, he went to Palestine, and they showed a lot of the local habits and the monuments. This is the tomb of the kings that had just been discovered not too long before. It shows that procession of clerics coming out of that very monumental architecture. And, you know, he went on and on. This is, again, as I say, a really sampling of what he painted. He was also known to show, and I couldn't find an example, but he made many paintings of Christ, but showing Christ much more, in a much more realistic way, as he would have looked, knowing the way people of his time were. But departing so much from the European way of representing Christ that he was criticized for that. People just didn't like the way that he showed that. That was, as I mentioned, much more realistic. All these painters, of course, had quite an influence, and we can just look at the next painting by Matisse, that of course is influenced by not only his trips to North Africa, but also by these works and that whole mentality of that appeal of the East or the exoticism of, what do I have that Vasily Vereshchagin in the middle? I don't know. The reclined odalisque. But you know that Matisse had in his studio made a whole corner where he would drape all these fabrics that he had bought in North Africa because they had coloring and design that was so different. And so he would make that little corner, that niche, if you want, where his models would lay down in a very appealing way so that he could paint them. Matisse had an incredible amount of props, objects, and textiles that he had bought there, and that he really enjoyed using. But it's not only in painting that we have Orientalism, we also have Orientalism in architecture, and I'm going to show you a few examples. Of course, going back to the 14th century, we have both, we have the Doge Palace on the right, but this is the early look of St. Mark in Venice, before it was adorned in a much more Gothic and Oriental way, both. This is actually very much influenced by a church that existed in Constantinople of the Holy Apostles and has been destroyed since. But St. Mark at first was really patterned after that painting, that church, and then was transformed into what we now know with mosaics and finials of all kinds. Much later on, and during the 18th century, every large palace needed a Chinese pavilion. This was part of the chinoiserie. Here we have in Potsdam the Chinese house. It's absolutely extraordinary, all decorated with golden Chinese looking figures. And of course, inside you have beautiful porcelain. But this was the idea of the Orient seen by the Western people. In Russia, we see one of the entrances, the Egyptian gates in Tsarskoye Selo, built in the early part of the 19th century. It looks like pylon, very much made of brick at that time, but shows you the interest in ancient Egypt architecture. In the Ukraine, we find the Vorontsov Palace, one of the entrances too, that looks like the entrance of a mosque. Totally different to the rest of the architecture, by the way. In Paris, the Foire du Caire building with these Egyptian-looking figures. The goddess Hathor. In the US, the Egyptian building of the Medical College of Virginia, that looks absolutely like the Egyptian building, and then you have the view of the winged god of sun, and then some other details, the typical Egyptian columns, and then inside the interior decoration is adequate, is similar. Not to forget, of course, the Brighton Pavilion, built in Brighton in 1815 by John Nash and Robert Jones. It was extended by them. It existed already before and became the residence of different of the princes, Prince Regent, later known as George IV, was there from 1811, started as a retreat for George, Prince of Wales in 1787. And then for most of the 19th century, it was decorated in a very extravagant way, mostly chinoiserie interior. And then in 1815 to 22, John Nash redesigned and extended the pavilion. This is where actually the prince was enjoying his liaison with his longtime companion, Mrs. Fitzherbert, that he wanted to marry, but finally did so secretly because she was a Roman Catholic, and so he was not allowed to marry her officially. Even Queen Victoria for a while went there, but then she decided to take Osborne House as her resort place. Here's the interior at the time of the one of the main reception room. And a view at night, which I think is really beautiful. It was, by the way, transformed into a hospital, but interestingly enough, for Indian soldiers during World War I. And then just some interior decoration. This was the room of Rudolf, Crown Prince of Austria, the one who committed suicide. That was in his residence in Vienna. That was his Turkish room. And for a while, the Turkish salon of the Waldorf Hotel in New York, that was decorated in that very Oriental way. I've joined, and you should have it in your leaflet, a bibliography. You have the Montagu, these are the letters that she wrote during her stay in Constantinople. Then the famous book by Edward Said. It's very interesting. It's not easy reading, but very important. Linda Nochlin, that's an article, and then I give you the link. And then another response to Edward Said by another author, and where you had that discussion on what is right and wrong with Orientalism. So next time we'll talk about the style troubadour, and we'll look also at some works by Goya. As I've already talked about Goya, I can't go extensively on that, but we can't take him away from that period. It's definitely, he has his side as a romantic painter. So let me stop the recording for whatever reason.